I never thought I'd find myself here, exhausted, broken, begging for help from the very people who brought me into this world. The smell of antiseptic still clings to my skin from the hospital, and the quiet in the house is almost deafening. Two tiny bodies lie in the next room, fragile and barely able to move on their own, as if the surgery had drained them of every ounce of strength. And me? I'm barely holding on. The first few days after the surgery, the world shrank down to feeding schedules, diaper changes, and the desperate monitoring of their breathing. Every slight whimper sent a wave of panic crashing through me, and every long silence felt like a ticking clock counting down to something worse. I knew I needed help, but asking felt like admitting failure. Failure as a mother, as a wife, as the woman who was supposed to hold it all together. Yet, here I was, on the phone with my parents, voice trembling as I swallowed my pride. I remember the moment clearly. The twins had just fallen into a fragile sleep after hours of crying, their tiny chests rising and falling with shallow breaths. My body ached from days without rest, and my mind was fraying at the edges. I reached for my phone with hands that barely felt steady and dialed my mother's number. When she answered, I tried to keep my voice steady, to make it sound like I was okay, but she heard it anyway, the desperation, the exhaustion. I told her I needed help, that the twins needed someone to watch them for just a few hours, maybe a day or two, while I caught up on rest and cared for myself. Surely she'd understand. Surely they would come. Instead, her voice turned cold, distant. The words that followed were like shards of ice stabbing through my chest. "You're asking too much," she said. "We're not your personal babysitters. You have a husband you should manage." Then came the silence, the heavy pause filled with judgment. I told her it wasn't about convenience. It was about survival. But she didn't hear me. Or maybe she chose not to. That's when they left. For a concert. A concert. I watched their social media posts. Laughter, bright lights, dancing, while I was trapped in a home that smelled like antiseptic wipes and desperation. Every smile they shared felt like a slap across my face. I kept telling myself to be strong, to hold on, to remember that family means support, that they'd come around. But every hour that passed without a call, without a message, chipped away at that hope. I felt smaller, invisible. The twins stirred, their soft cries slicing through the silence. I pulled them close, cradling their fragile forms, and wondered how I had become so alone. The concert photos didn't just sting, they broke something inside me. I kept staring at their smiles, the carefree glow on their faces, and the way they clung to each other like the world was nothing but joy and music and laughter.
But what about me?
What about my twins, still fragile from surgery, barely able to breathe on their own? What about the house that echoed with their soft cries and my silent pleas? I tried calling my mother again. The phone rang a few times before going to voicemail. No answer. My heart dropped. My father's number was the same. No answer. I sat on the couch, the twins wrapped against my chest in a soft blanket, their little hands curled around my fingers like tiny lifelines. The clock ticked loudly in the quiet room, each second mocking me with its relentless forward march. I tried to remind myself that maybe they just needed a break, that maybe this concert was their way to recharge before they came back to help me. But the gnawing feeling in my gut whispered something darker. They had chosen their own comfort over their family's urgent need. Hours later, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my sister. Not the supportive kind, but one laced with thinly veiled judgment. "Mom and Dad said you're overwhelmed. Maybe you should have thought of that before having twins." The words stung sharper than any cold shoulder. I sank into the couch, tears spilling freely now, not just for the exhaustion, but for the betrayal. The people who should have been my refuge were the ones leaving me stranded in a storm I never asked to weather alone. As night fell, I paced the room, rocking one twin while the other lay in the crib, too weak to cry. I thought of all the times they held me as a child, all the promises whispered under starlit skies about always being there. But promises are fragile things, easily broken when the stakes are real. I knew I couldn't keep doing this alone, but with every call unanswered, every message ignored, I felt more isolated. It was like the world had narrowed to just the three of us in a house that was supposed to be a home, but felt more like a cage. And still, the concert pictures remained, taunting reminders that while I fought for my twins' survival, my own parents were dancing under neon lights, choosing music over family. I waited days before I had the courage to call them again. Each ring echoed like a countdown to a confrontation I both dreaded and needed. When my mother finally picked up, the words I had bottled inside poured out with a rawness I couldn't control. I told her how alone I felt, how helpless I was with the twins barely recovering and the nights stretching endlessly before me. I reminded her of the promises, the warmth I once knew from their arms. But her voice was guarded, defensive, like I was accusing her of a crime. She told me she didn't understand why I needed so much help, that having twins was my choice, that my husband should be stepping up more. I tried to explain the surgery's toll, the fragility of my babies, my own limits. But it was like speaking to a wall made of cold stone. Then came the truth, the part one never expected. She confessed that they had been struggling themselves. Their health, their finances, the exhaustion of their own lives. The concert wasn't just a selfish escape, but a desperate attempt to hold onto a sliver of normalcy before everything crumbled. They felt helpless, watching me drown and not knowing how to save me. Instead of support, their fear turned into distance. I sat with that for hours, the silence between her words heavier than any accusation. It didn't excuse their actions, but it painted the fractures in a family I thought was unbreakable. I told her that despite everything, I still needed them, not just physically, but emotionally. But the conversation ended with more questions than answers, with no clear resolution. In that moment, I realized that family isn't just about blood or promises. Sometimes, it's about choosing who shows up when the world feels like it's falling apart. I hung up feeling empty, but strangely lighter. The confrontation had cracked the surface of pain, revealing raw wounds beneath. Whether they would heal was still uncertain. I looked down at the twins asleep in their bassinets, their fragile breaths steady now. They were my world, my reason to fight. And fight I would. After that painful conversation with my mother, I realized something vital. If I waited for my family to show up for me, I might be waiting forever. The space they left behind wasn't just empty. It was a chasm filled with unmet expectations and broken promises. My twins needed me whole, even if my parents weren't the ones to help. I started reaching out, to friends, to neighbors, to community groups. I found a small circle of people who didn't judge or dismiss me for needing help. They listened. They showed up. Some brought meals. Others just sat quietly while I cried. It wasn't the family support I had hoped for, but it was something real. One afternoon, as I carried my twins through the living room, my neighbor knocked on the door, her hands filled with homemade soup and baby toys. It was the first time in weeks I felt a flicker of warmth in my chest, not because the pain was gone, but because I wasn't completely alone. Even my husband, who had been buried in work and trying not to break under the weight of it all, began to find ways to step in. He changed diapers, rocked the babies to sleep, and held me when I felt like I might shatter. It was far from perfect, but it was enough. Still, the echoes of my parents' absence haunted me. I'd catch myself scrolling through their social media, their laughter like a ghost whispering of what I didn't have. But then I'd look down at my twins, their tiny fingers gripping mine, and remember that family can be chosen as much as it can be given. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was fighting to build something new, something stronger. I knew the road ahead would be long and full of moments where I'd want to give up. But for them, for myself, I had to keep moving forward. And maybe one day, I'd find a way to forgive. Not for them, but for me. Months have passed since that difficult time. The days when I felt completely broken and abandoned. The twins are stronger now, their laughter filling the rooms where silence once echoed. I'm still tired, still juggling everything that comes with motherhood, but there's a lightness inside me that wasn't there before. I've learned that healing isn't linear. It's messy, filled with setbacks and small victories. There are days when the memories of being called a burden sting fresh, when the absence of my parents feels like a hollow ache beneath my ribs. But I've also discovered reserves of strength I never knew I had. I don't know if my parents will ever truly understand what I went through. Maybe they never will. But I've made peace with the fact that sometimes love isn't enough, not without action, without presence. Instead, I choose to focus on the family I've built, the tiny hands that reach for me in the night, the husband who is learning how to be my partner, and the friends who became my lifeline. I wonder often if sharing this story will help someone out there feeling invisible, overwhelmed, or alone. If it does, then maybe my pain wasn't in vain. So here I am, still standing, still fighting, still hoping. If you've ever felt like a burden when you were only asking for help, know that you are not alone. And maybe, just maybe, the people who truly love you will show up in unexpected ways. Would you forgive someone who walked away when you needed them most? Or would you choose to protect your own heart and build new bridges? I don't have all the answers, but I'm learning, day by day, to trust in myself again. The days following my conversation with my parents became a turning point, a moment when everything I thought I knew about family, love, and support started to shift. After the cold silence from them and the betrayal that cut deeper than I imagined, I felt like I was drowning in a sea of exhaustion and hopelessness. But sometimes, when the people you expect to be there vanish, life surprises you with support from places you never imagined. I remember the exact moment it happened. I was barely holding myself together. The twins' post-surgery needs hadn't lessened, and I was struggling to keep up with their feeding schedules, medications, and the relentless nights filled with endless crying. My body was aching, my mind was fogged, and tears had become an everyday visitor. I was sitting on the edge of my bed when my phone buzzed, a message from someone I hadn't heard from in years. It was Leora, my old college friend, the one I'd lost touch with after life got complicated. We used to be inseparable, sharing late-night talks and dreams about the future. But time and distance had pulled us apart. Her message was simple, almost casual. I heard about the twins. I'm here if you need anything. At first, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to shield myself from disappointment. What if she'd just said it out of obligation and never followed through? But something in those words felt genuine. I typed back a shaky reply. I don't know if I can do this alone. What happened next changed everything. Within hours, Leora showed up at my doorstep, arms full of homemade meals and care packages for the babies. She didn't ask for explanations or judge my situation. She simply rolled up her sleeves and started helping. She held the twins while I showered, made calls, and caught a few hours of much-needed sleep. It was the first time since the surgery that I felt a spark of hope, a reminder that kindness could come from unexpected places. Leora didn't just bring physical help, she brought emotional refuge. She listened without judgment as I spilled my fears, my anger, and my heartbreak. She didn't try to fix things or offer platitudes. She just sat with me in the messiness of it all. As the days turned into weeks, her visits became a lifeline. She helped with doctor appointments, stayed late during my husband's long shifts, and even organized a small support group for moms in similar situations. I realized I wasn't as alone as I thought. There were others struggling quietly, and together, we began to build a community. But support isn't always easy to accept. There were moments when my pride pushed back, when I questioned whether I was weak for needing help. Society often tells us that mothers should be invincible, that asking for assistance is a failure. I wrestled with those voices daily. One afternoon, after a particularly rough night, I found myself breaking down in front of Leora. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the betrayal from my own family, it all came crashing down. She didn't flinch. Instead, she held me, reminding me that strength isn't about carrying the weight alone, but knowing when to reach out. This extra episode in my life taught me that family isn't always defined by blood or tradition. It's defined by presence, by compassion, and by showing up when it matters most. Looking back, I understand now why my parents couldn't be what I needed. Their own struggles blinded them, and their choices hurt deeply. But I also learned that healing comes from building new bridges to people who will walk beside you, even when the road is dark. My twins are growing stronger every day, And so am I. The scars of those early months remain, but they remind me of how far we've come. They remind me that even in the darkest moments, light can find its way in. If you're listening to this story and feeling alone, remember this. Help can come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes, it's a friend from the past reaching out. Sometimes, it's a stranger offering a meal or a listening ear. And sometimes, it's simply the courage to ask for help, even when it feels impossible. Would you have accepted help if it came from someone you least expected? How do you rebuild trust when those closest to you let you down? These are the questions I'm still learning to answer.